Welcome, everybody. It's so great to see so many of you connected or connecting. I'm Sebastian Faber. I'm the chair of the Board of Governors of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives. And as you probably know, ALBA is an educational nonprofit that works to keep alive and to keep relevant the legacy of the close to 3,000 volunteers who left from the United States to help defend the Spanish Republic against fascism during the Spanish Civil War in the second half of the 1930s. Our motto is threefold: teaching history, inspiring activism, and upholding human rights. In addition to lectures such as this one, ALBA organizes film screenings, workshops for high school teachers. Actually, we have one coming up this summer. So if you are a teacher or you know a teacher, please let them know about the workshop that we're organizing for this July. And we also organize an annual essay contest for high school and college and graduate students. We also publish a quarterly magazine, The Volunteer, both on paper and online. And we grant an annual Human Rights Award with the support of the Puffin Foundation. Our work is sustained entirely by donors. This event is free, of course, but if you feel so inclined, please consider supporting our work with the tax-deductible gift. You can click on the link in the chat or simply Google Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives, go to the website and click on donate. The Susman Lecture, which we are having tonight, was established in 1998 in honor of William or Bill Susman, who served as a lieutenant in the 15th International Brigade in Spain and continued to fight fascism in the US Armed Forces during World War II. And after that, became a lifelong activist. In the 1970s, Bill helped found what is now the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives. He passed away in 2003. Today, we are really thrilled to welcome this year's Susman lecturer, Marc Fasanella, to speak with us about the life and work of his father, the Lincoln vet, activist, and painter, Ralph Fasanella. On a side note, it's only fitting, we think, that this event be held just before Memorial Day, because although the Spanish Civil War vets are not officially recognized on Memorial Day, this is a day that many of us do choose to honor them as well. Marc will be introduced by our moderator today, Luis Saiz Taveras, a rising senior at Hunter College. Luis Saiz Taveras is Thomas Hunter Honor Scholar, pursuing a major in clinical psychology, a minor in women and gender studies, a certificate in human rights, and a mini concentration in Japanese culture. Her investment in human connections, pursuit of new experiences, and passion for travel has inspired her to become a humanitarian aid worker with a focus on restoring and maintaining the rights of others, as well as their accessibility to mental health resources. One final note before we continue: we are recording this event, so you can watch it again if you want after this is over on our website. If you would prefer not to have your face show on the recording as you ask questions, just don't turn your camera on, and that takes care of that. All right, over to you, Luis Saiz.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you all today. I came to know Marc Fasanella, our guest speaker for this evening, during my time in Maria Hernandez Ojeda's class in the Spanish Civil War at Hunter College during the fall semester of 2020. My classmates and I were tasked with the responsibility of writing our final essay on the experiences of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade volunteer of our choice. An essential aspect of this research and understanding the volunteer's life before and after the Spanish Civil War was through the interviews we conducted with their relatives and loved ones. My knowledge or awareness of the Spanish Civil War was nearly non-existent prior to taking this course. Nonetheless, Marc's vivid recollection and anecdotes of his father, Ralph Fasanella, who you'll be learning more about today, and his personal upbringing gave way for our interview to be one of the most enriching experiences of my academic journey thus far. Marc Fasanella's exposure to issues of social justice and environmental activism has inspired his lifelong passion for art and sustainability, permitting him to become a hybrid professor of art and ecological design. Among Marc's accomplishments, he is the founding director of the Ecological Culture Initiative and author. His recent book about his father, which I have right here, Ralph Fasanella, Images of Optimism, is well written and beautifully crafted, illustrating with over 70 images of his father's paintings. Throughout the years, his father's legacy has remained a part of Marc's advocacy and work. Marc's upbringing with a mother who was a progressive educator and a father who was a self-taught social realist painter gave him the tools to be outspoken in his political convictions. The canvases that Marc one witnessed his father working tirelessly on today serve as a reminder of Ralph's important contributions to the legacy of progressive artistic activism. On behalf of ALBA, I would like to thank you all for honoring those who are no longer with us, but who once fought for the creation of a more just and fair world. Please make sure to write your questions in this chat function, and if your questions are selected, we'll have the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask them to Marc at the end of his lecture. With that, I will pass it on to Marc. Sorry for the background noise. I'm in Harlem.
That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much. So thank you all for coming. I really feel honored to have this opportunity to honor my father and bring his work into the context of some of the issues that we're facing today. So if it's okay with you all, I'd like to launch right into the presentation. And that is an exhibit that a young woman named Naomi Johnson and I have curated for a new website about my father's work, which I'll tell you more about later on. And the exhibit is entitled American Tragedy, because in thinking about my father's work, one of the aspects is that he really, actually many years ago, I was talking to a psychologist, and he said, isn't it amazing how engaged with his time that your father was? And he was very engaged in the times in which he lived and did his best to chronicle the kind of challenges that we face as American citizens. So he was born in 1914 and lived until 1997. So in many ways, his life spanned the 20th century. And he really was a child who, like many of the vets, was born into a world without refrigeration, without car automobiles. His father drove an ice wagon in New York City and delivered ice to people who lived in tenement houses. So he really had an experience of a world that was in constant change. But what he took out of it after going through a bunch of different iterations in his life was this phrase that I don't think he wrote or created this phrase, but it is on his tombstone as his epitaph. Remember who you are, remember where you came from, don't forget the past, change the world. That outlook really affected me, and I think a lot about the times that he lived in and how that affects the time we live in now. So my father was born in 1914, and of course, World War I started in 1914. And when you think about the amount of tumult that he was born into, and that his first few years of infancy were in a context of a world in turmoil and constant struggle. And on the heels, or actually during that, you see the Russian Revolution happening. And that also very much shaped his world and the world of so many people who were born at that time. And it's difficult for us to understand how important that Russian Revolution was and how much it changed people's outlooks now that we're over 100 years away from it. He was born into this context. That's the tenement apartment that my father was raised in as a young man in Little Italy, the corner of Bleecker and Sullivan. Down at the bottom, you can see the stores run by immigrants, and you can see my grandfather's ice wagon. And that is my grandmother, Ginevra, and she's in two places. Here at the center of the image with a neighbor and her 6 children. And then here, also crucified on a cross with the threads that she used as a seamstress working in the Triangle Shirt Factory. Over on the right, you can see my grandfather, Giuseppe, and he's not present in the room because he actually, the American dream failed him. He came to the United States, he worked very hard delivering ice, refrigeration began to replace his career, and his wife ended up having an affair with an Italian anarchist while she was working with my father at the same time as a young man at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. So in this painting, my mother and father are both in this room. In fact, my father's in several locations, working, steaming and pressing buttonholes, and then also moving things around the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. This factory was the scene prior to the time they worked there in 1911 of the famous Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where a large number of young women immigrant women jumped out of the windows. And of course, this is still happening today in Indonesia. People there are being kind of locked in buildings and filling these contracts for apparel that goes into major stores. But he tried to really capture much of what was happening and what affected him in his life. So in the center, you see the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory where he worked with his mother, and you see the cleanliness and the order of it and the relationship that people have. If you were able to see this painting up close, you'll see how much interaction there is between the people that are sitting at the tables sewing. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the post-World War II buildings where my mother worked in shipping and receiving as a secretary, and all the offices that were related to it. On the right-hand side, you see the later part of his life. So this kind of painting shows the arc of his life to where he ended up owning a gas station in the Bronx. So the vehicles that are in the bottom of that painting are vehicles from the 60s and 70s. And these are the buildings that would have been in the South Bronx where he has gas station. And he rented out U-Hauls. So you see some U-Hauls down here. So this gives you an idea. It's not one of the paintings in the exhibit, but it gives you an idea of the milieu and the things that ended up shaping and radicalizing my father. His mother was a very intellectual person, and she became radicalized in this factory by an Italian labor organizer, Italian immigrant labor organizer, who they ended up having a romantic relationship, and then those ideas were transmitted to my father. The Spanish Civil War, of course, began in 1936 and ran through 1939. So at the age of 22, that upbringing of having grown up a member of the working class, the child of immigrants, seeing the struggles they threw, his father failing, going back to Italy when he was 14 and never returning, really shaped him and made him realize that this quest for a more just and egalitarian society that was embodied in what they saw in the hope of the Russian Revolution was something that he should join up and become a part of. And of course, World War II then really changed the balance of power. And you see, because of that good fight that was lost, you see the rise of Hitler and Mussolini into a context that we know very well now. So many people my age and younger are saying these are unprecedented times. And they're really not unprecedented times. When I think about my father's life and the vets and the experiences they had, they certainly went through times that were every bit as challenging. Remember, after World War I, we had the Spanish flu, which is very similar to the pandemic we had. And they certainly had leaders that were every bit as destructive as the leaders that we see taking power today. So what's amazing, when you look at the definition of fascism, and I just looked up on my computer on Apple, there's a dictionary, and I looked up the definition of fascism. And I love this quote. So fascism tends to include the belief in the supremacy of one national or ethnic group, a contempt for democracy, an insistence on obedience to a powerful leader, and a strong demagogic approach. So of course that sounds incredibly reminiscent of Modi, Netanyahu, Trump. We're living in a time where fascism is very much at the forefront because we have this notion of supremacy, which I'll return to, which is very damaging. And then demagogue, this is something that we thought we would have dealt with in the mid part of the 20th century, that demagogues would be kind of outed and shown for what they were doing, but we're still very much struggling with these concepts. Dogma, where people have kind of unflagging belief to a set of ideals that are fixed and they will not reason through on their own. They'll rely on a demagogue for their thinking. Greed, the notion that one group should, or one individual should benefit in ways that others don't, and supremacy. And I'll show you later how these concepts are not only at the core of what we faced in the middle of the 20th century, but are at the core of what we face today in the 21st century. So my father's radicalism is really memorialized in this very early painting that he did called May Day. And I was looking at this morning and I was like, wow, it's actually Candyland or Chutes and Ladders. And of course, the May Day parades in this era, May Day is an American holiday. It was started as a holiday to celebrate the American worker early in the 20th century. And now has been replaced after the McCarthy era, which we'll get to, by Labor Day. And it's still celebrated by workers around the world, in Germany and Switzerland and all over the world. There are huge May Day parades. And my father used to go to these May Day parades, and they really got a visceral feeling of how the world was going to change and how people were going to go from those dark tenements and apartment blocks on the left-hand side in the city, and then end up on this golden path to life and a more harmonious existence that you see on the right-hand side. And you see how positive it is in its colors. It's a much more bright and luminous painting than it is in this image. And it is at the Fenimore Art Museum and on display. I think it's on display at this minute. You can very often see it at the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown. These are large canvases. If you saw the size of the large canvas, this one's 50 by 80. It's called Garden Party. This painting actually was just purchased this past week. And at the center of this painting, you see the Rosenbergs, and you see them being immolated on a pile of radical books. And around them, there is this party of the elites. And you can see a kind of Last Supper inside the Capitol building, where the military-industrial complex is celebrating their win, essentially, over progressive, secular, Jewish intellectual politics. And you see on the kind of debauched leadership of the military here kind of falling over at the table, and you'll see that repeated again. And the protesters from all walks of life, Black, white, middle class, working class, who are protesting the execution of the Rosenbergs. It was really the seminal event of my father's life. And if he wasn't already radicalized by the events of the Spanish Civil War and by ideas that were circulating around the time of the Russian Revolution, this execution of a young couple with 2 young children really made him a lifelong committed radical. This next painting, which actually we're trying to find a home for at the moment, it's a companion painting in many ways to a painting, the title painting of this exhibit, American Tragedy. This next painting is a painting entitled Gray Day, and it really chronicles the Rosenberg era in so many ways. So again, you see on the right-hand side, the military-industrial complex, and they're almost ghoul-like figures, very pale. Here's the court where their case was decided, and in a very small image, it's kind of like Edward Munch's Face the Screen, but the judge has dark glasses on because it's blind justice doing the bidding of an elite. Here on the left and the right, you see Michael and Robbie Mirapol, the children of the Rosenbergs. And it's a very interesting story. Michael and Robbie were adopted after the Rosenbergs' execution by Abel Mirapol and his wife. Abel Mirapol wrote the song Strange Fruit, immortalized by Billie Holiday. On the left-hand side, again, you see those factories that my father had worked in as a young man. And then you see the mourners now. They're not protesting anymore. They've turned their backs and they're going home in a very solemn tribute to the Rosenbergs. And you see some people with yarmulkes, because many people felt that the secular Jewish community, especially in New York City, where my father had grown up, my mother had grown up, were kind of the intellectual hope of the future. So this act of anti-Semitism to execute this couple was really a very dark and chilling message to progressives. Also, the Rosenbergs were executed for supposedly slipping the secret of the atomic bomb, or trying to slip the secret of the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. And here this A is both the scarlet letter A, but it also stands for atomic energy. It also stands for an oil derrick. And then this is a mushroom cloud and the face of the devil. And he pulled a lot of this imagery from the time that he was incarcerated in a Catholic protectorate as a young man. He was caught and convicted or charged with truancy and petty theft as a young man, and he went in and out of a Catholic protectorate, which essentially was a juvenile prison run by the Diocese of New York. And that imagery you can really see from the stained glass windows in how he creates his compositions. This is the title painting for the exhibit, The American Tragedy, and you see both a combination of Goldwater and Johnson and an oil businessman riding over Kennedy's grave. There's a fantastic essay about this painting in the exhibit catalog that Naomi Johnson, the co-curator with me of this exhibit, has created this catalog, and Paul D'Ambrosio, the CEO of the Fenimore Art Museum, has written this fantastic essay. He did his dissertation on my father, and so you can learn a lot more about this painting. And then you also see here that you have both those missile silos and oil derricks burning off the oil on this side. You see the Kennedy assassination, and a little grassy knoll, and protesters for the civil rights movement being dragged off both here and then up here where you see the burning of the buses down south, and the Ku Klux Klan and the military industrial complex dancing essentially around a symbol of atomic war again, that religious imagery that he uses. And you see here it says Ruby's Carousel. Each one of these paintings really could be the subject of an in-depth study. And I've been looking for people who have knowledge. I was born in 1964. This painting was created in 1964. So I've been looking for people from this time who'd be interested in writing essays about these paintings. This is a painting called McCarthy Press, which is at the American Folk Art Museum. The last painting is in a private collection. And here you see all the headlines. So again, you would have to really spend time and read through these headlines to understand all the symbolism, where he's really trying to, you can see that the line of mourners again, and you see, you know, the casket and the burial here for the Rosenbergs at the end of their time. So, you know, in each one of these, this means both save money and save our souls. Again here, save money and save our souls. So you really see him trying to take the imagery and the symbolism of the time he was living and bring them into these paintings. This is a painting entitled The Kennedy Years, 50 by 80, also at the Fenimore Art Museum. And you get this idea that it's a carousel. Our economy is kind of a carousel, and you'd see them dropping this golden coin, like you used to have the hoop on the carousel, into the military industrial complex. And then it's really like a casino. And then sports. My father loves sports and the Olympics, but it's also the opiate of the people, distracting them from what's going on here, and the kind of showgirls that are distracting people from what's actually happening in their society. And then everything from the Frazier fight, gambling on the Frazier fight, a lot of the issues of his time he's trying to capture. And again, at the center, the Rosenbergs. This is a painting entitled The Mad 60s. And again, you see the Rosenbergs, the atomic bomb, satellite, the beginning of the satellite communications, the military industrial complex, and baseball, which he was a huge fan of, but serving as the opiate of the people. This is a painting entitled A-Bomb. And this painting, he ran a gas station, as I mentioned, in the Bronx. And he's kind of making this the vehicle of capitalism. So you see this kind of fantastic where nuclear energy is driving it, and you see the Capitol, you see that young man who immolated himself protesting against the Vietnam War, and then the church driving a Volkswagen bus, which of course is a symbol from World War II, when Hitler really wanted to use Volkswagen as a way to create the people's car, and coming into this engine that's running the US economy and American life. And then you see a general with being blinded by a showgirl. This is a painting called Modern Times. And in this painting, my father's both showing the Pope's visit to Shea Stadium and the incredible attention that it got, distracting people from things that were happening at the time and the entrance of the Vietnam War. But also he's trying to show how an elite has come to kind of merge art and science. And so what you see on the right-hand side is, as the Museum of Art evolved from a very contemporary but earthy repository for art, where they were really trying to say something meaningful about the culture as it evolved, it then started to become a place for elites. So you see them celebrating in what's kind of an amalgam of the UN, and then also this art that he considered dead art. And the museum becomes kind of like a mausoleum where the art is on display in these air-conditioned rooms and you can't get too close to it. And you see this fusion now of the culture of the elite, from the atomic bomb being developed up here, to these meetings in the UN, like all of it's being fused into this very unified, monolithic elite. But then in 1964, he also painted this painting because he did see what was happening in his time in the sexual revolution. So you see lesbian couples here and homosexual couples, and the altar has become a bed. And he's really kind of capturing the sexual revolution and the evolution of the city. So you see on the right of the love goddess at the center of the painting, you see those old 1904 pre-war buildings, and then changing to the post-war steel buildings, and then to the post-World War II modernist buildings, where they had become kind of unidentifiable glass blocks. And at the center of it all is this church where young people are kind of reinventing culture. And he's celebrating that in the midst of all this tragedy. So in 1972, Milton Glaser, who's best known for I Love New York, but is and his Dylan poster, but was an absolutely seminal graphic designer and influenced graphic designers, still influencing graphic designers today, has an important place in the history of graphic design. At the time, he and Clay Felker had a magazine called New York Magazine, and that magazine was like Time Out is today. If you wanted to know where to get the best pastrami sandwich, if you wanted to know what art exhibit to go see, even down to the classified ads, people relied on New York Magazine, who were New Yorkers. And then in a cover in October of 1972, they put my father on it, and Nicholas Pileggi wrote an article that said, "This man pumps gas in the Bronx for a living. He may also be the best primitive painter since Grandma Moses." He didn't like the title primitive, but boy, did this change his life. And it changed it in both good and bad ways. You can see right after that, 1975, he's still chronicling his times. It's called American Heritage. And you see the fallout of Watergate and era, and you see all of the people that he wants to memorialize, many of whom, there's an essay that I wrote in the exhibit catalog. But you know, all the people that he wanted to memorialize, King and the Rosenbergs, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, are down here in these crypts. And there are other coffins at the center of the Rosenbergs, but he's showing the difference between these people who are everyday people, important political people, and then over here, King's funeral. But what I love is there's a little funeral for the Black family here that's very tight-knit and paying respects to their family member without all the pomp and circumstance and the line of people coming to view. He's saying really that anybody who goes through life and struggles through life deserves to be memorialized in the way that these big state funerals memorialize people, and that we should, you know, pay more attention to people while they're alive and memorialize them for their ideas, not for their positions in society. This is a painting that I can't even begin to take all of it in, but it really captures the Nixon era. Again, the Pope's visit. So you see Nixon in many places. He's up here, he's over here, kind of playing a pool game with the future, the Nixon Memorial over here. There's my grandfather's ice wagon. There's a trotter, and then a truck again with all of these coffins. Ague's in, Ague's out, Met's in, excuse me. So he's really trying to capture all of these events that are happening in the 1970s, Vietnam War, capture them all on one canvas. And I've been speaking with a colleague about writing an essay for the exhibit catalog about these times. I mean, everything from a swastika and this kind of carnival spinning top ride that is American life. So he's really capturing all of these things that are kind of keeping all of our consciences tangled up with everyday events. And then by the time the 1980s come around, I don't know if you remember that period where there was a famous headline in the Daily News, "Ford to City, dropped dead," because the city was in such bad shape that they asked the federal government to bail out because New York City was going to go bankrupt, and Ford said that the federal government would not bail out New York City. At this time, I actually got off a subway platform in the Bronx, went to the bottom of the subway platform, and there was an overturned police car that had been set on fire. And that was not something that was on the news. That was an everyday occurrence. People were throwing bricks at police. It was a really out of control city. And it's when Milton Glaser came up with that "I Love New York" symbol. And so he really tried to capture what was happening to him personally. His personal fortunes were much better. His paintings were selling for better prices. You can see his gas station, Happy and Bud over here. But the world around him was changing. All of those progressive ideals that he believed in and fought for and really tried to steer the world towards a more just and egalitarian economic system and kind of personal ethics was falling apart. But at the same time, I went with my father to the gas station that he ran, and you can see the pumps were knocked over. And there's a painting he painted of that scene where there were people selling potatoes and crack out of the gas station when we went down to visit it after he had sold it many years before. But he's also painting it in a very positive way. So this painting, I Love New York, is still in the estate collection, and we have it on the market trying to find a good collector who's building a collection for a museum or a museum itself. And you really see he's taking this incredibly tumultuous time where there's just chaos and anarchy, but he's also painting it in a way that is uplifting and positive, because his own world was kind of uplifted and positive on a personal basis because his art was successful. And my sister and I were getting out of the house. And then you see this painting, Ron's Rolling. The colors begin to get a little darker. His technique of painting changed and became more flat and less sophisticated. And I think that's because he became disengaged in some ways from the society around him. The Soviet Union collapsed, and Reagan took the United States and took it from being the greatest creditor nation and made it the greatest debtor nation, from a nation that exported more goods than it imported to a nation that imported more goods than it exported. And all of that was done to bankrupt the Soviet Union in a huge military arms race. And that was very disorienting for my father. And living a more kind of suburban life. So you see on the left-hand side, the train riders commuting to the city from the Westchester suburb that he lived in. And that's a luncheonette on the right-hand side that was run by a couple of Jewish Holocaust survivors. And they ran this little luncheonette in the town Ardsley that I grew up in. And so you see the blind news dealer down the bottom, which is a repainting of a painting he did at the start of his career. The kind of irony of somebody selling news who can't actually read the headlines, and the symbolism that represents for what the press is and how people are kind of blindly accepting what's happening in the world around them. So the painting became flatter because my father was never formally taught how to paint. He was a self-taught social realist. So in some ways, his work belongs in that genre of people depicting the political life of their times, but he was self-taught. And when he got to the point where he was less engaged in the world around him because it became so disorienting, he actually lost his ability to paint. And he never finished this painting. This painting is called Farewell Comrade. It's the last painting that he created. And the painting was finished by a young man who he had hired to help him. We're not sure who that young man is. If anybody knows who's out there, we'd love to find him and give him credit for his work on this painting. But you really see him kind of showing all of the thought that drove his life. Fidel Castro, Gandhi, all of these names that are down here, the Rosenbergs again, Paul O'Dwyer. These are people and the books that he read that really meant Jack London, who had a huge influence on him and on my life. All of these things that he was fighting for on the left-hand side. You see no more wars, jobs for all, free education. He's kind of saw that slipping away. And you see Reagan triples deficit with the military and a connection between how the United States bankrupted itself in trying to topple the Soviet Union, Yeltsin. So the idea that I think is so important in this exhibit is not only that it's my father's work, but that I think it's important for us to look at and understand and bring attention to artwork that chronicles the political life of the times that people live in. One of the people that I think of very often, but when thinking about that, I was introduced to recently, is Kent Monkman. His work can be hard to look at. It deals with a lot of contemporary issues related to sexuality, but it also deals with the tragedy of the Indigenous people in Canada. The painting my father could never create was the painting on the Spanish Civil War. He stretched canvases, he made preparatory sketches, but he couldn't paint it because it represented to him this tremendous failure of the human race that he just couldn't bring himself to paint. So if my father's epitaph was remember who you are, remember where you came from, don't forget the past, change the world. As an educator, I took the epitaph for myself. I hope this, I won't have a tombstone. I hope to be composted now that it's legalized in New York State. But I would like to take the epitaph, remember the past, understand the present, and envision the future. And I want to relate what chronicling the political life of your times means to the time that we live in today. Of course, we're constantly hearing and seeing people trying to grapple with the issue of climate change. But what we see proposed as a solution are innovations and the notion that technology will save us. And technology will not save us. The atomic bomb did not save us. Certainly solar panels, wind turbines, electric light bulbs, LED light bulbs, and electric cars will not save us. All of them are rooted in this notion of the dogmas that the human being has the ability to innovate its way out of any problem, and that we are a supreme species, and that we are at the top of the heap, and that we can exploit resources. So all of those technologies rely on extracting and exploiting resources from the ecosystem. So what I would like to do with the rest of my life, and if anybody's interested in this, taking on this challenge with me, is create two things. The Center for Social Realism, where artwork by people like Kent Monkman and Sue Coe, attention can be brought to their work. And then also the Ecological Culture Institute, because one of the things that's important for us to understand, if during my father's time, all the way through the middle of the 20th century, we were grappling with the issue, in the late 20th century, grappling with the issue of a more just and egalitarian society, based upon what we know now about the world that encompasses us, that we do not have dominion over, it has dominion over us. We need to have a culture that reflects a knowledge of ecology and moves away from the dogmas of supremacy that really still underlie, and greed that still underlie all of human endeavor at this moment. So I really want to thank Naomi Johnson, who helped me curate this exhibit. She is a graphic designer and professional writer who is, and also designing the website for Fasanella.org. And she is a senior at Michigan State University. And she is doing this through the auspices of an organization called Matrix. Matrix is the Center for Digital Humanities at Michigan State. And there's a fantastic man there named Dean Rainberger, who is at the head of it. I think I have another slide that thanks him. And I also want to give special thanks to Ron Carver and John Beck. They are the people who are responsible for creating Fasanella.org. It was not created by myself or the estate of Ralph Fasanella. It was created by these two men and Dean Rainberger. And they just asked me to step in and try to bring new life and attention to it. For the exhibit catalog, which you can find online, Janet Zandi and Paul D'Ambrosio have written these fantastic essays. Janet is a professor emeritus of working class studies from RIT, and Paul, as I mentioned, is the director and CEO of the Fenimore Art Museum. If you're interested in my father's work, you can find reproductions of his work through the Fasanella.org website or through Museums & Co. And then if you are interested in actually purchasing one of his paintings, they are in the 5 and 6 figures. And much of that money, it's not like my sister and I benefit directly from that money. There's fingers in the pie, but we are trying to sell some of the paintings that remain in the estate. And we are, every purchase that's made from museums.co and from the paintings, we are trying to help Fasanella.org and Michigan State with the project of running that and hopefully creating the Center for Social Realism. So the next exhibit that will happen is going to be at the Fenimore Art Museum. called Ralph Fasanella, Americans Unseen. There will also be a companion exhibit at some point at the Hill Gallery in Birmingham, Michigan. And I really want to thank the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and the Susman family for creating this opportunity, to Maria Hernandez Ojeda for introducing me to Louis Seiss, who interviewed me, and to Mark, Dennis, and Sebastian. Sebastian, I'm sorry, I forgot to put your name on the slide, for making all of what happened today possible. And I really would be remiss if I didn't thank my mother, because she really brought attention to my father's work that would not have been there if she hadn't really believed in him as an artist and as an individual. She really devoted her life after a successful career and during a very successful career as an elementary school teacher, to making my father's work something that had a place in the world of art history. So if you want to find out more about this exhibit, it's all at fasanella.org. And if you want to find out more about me or send me an email, all the information you would want to know about me is on marcfasanella.com, including my email address, my phone number. So please reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions. And reach out to me via email if your question doesn't get asked during today's presentation.
Thank you, Mark. That was so awesome. I know you were not looking at the chat, but many people said Eva Rock and that they have paintings of your father in their own homes. So that's awesome. The first question comes from Jack Hammond. I don't know, Jack, if you're present still and if you're able to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Yes, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Listen, thanks. That was really terrific, and I appreciated all of it. And I actually have at least 10 or 15 questions, but I will restrain myself because I know everybody else wants to ask questions too. I think the one I put 2 questions in the chat, but the one I'm most interested. Oh, before I just say that, I also want to say that I met your father once. And I have a signed copy of the Bread and Roses strike hanging in my office at Hunter College. And Louis Seiss, I'm sorry we never met each other. But in any case, I'm delighted to see what is happening to one of our very talented graduates, and keep it up. So Mark, the one question I'm going to ask is, how did your father get started painting?
Oh, that's an interesting story. And I have somebody I didn't send an email to. So my father had a friend named Virginia Simon, a very close friend. And they went on a trip together and she had some art materials with her. She was a more educated intellectual, formally educated intellectual. My father was a very self-educated intellectual. And he always had restless fingers. He was and he thought maybe he had some form of arthritis. He was always taking matchbooks and tearing them up as a young man. He was a very agitated guy. And she said, well, why don't you try sketching? So he made 3 sketches during that trip, one of a rowboat, one of the cabin interior, and one of the cabin exterior. I still have those sketches. And they were pretty accomplished for somebody who had never drawn before. And she said, you really should take this seriously. So he tried taking a few art classes, and he really just didn't like it. He found that, drawing from a sitting figure or from a still life, he found it to be kind of dead and inanimate. And so he started sketching incessantly on the subway. And throughout his entire life, he was not a very good draftsman. The first drawings that he did were actually more accomplished than many of the later drawings that he did. But he sketched incessantly, and it wasn't to create art or create studies for compositions. It was to capture the positions of people. It was almost entirely people. There are some interiors and some street scenes, but really he would sit on the subway or in luncheonettes and diners through his entire life and sketch people on whatever paper he could get his hands on, from a napkin to the placemat in a diner. And there was a huge collection of sketchbooks when he passed away, most of which had 10, 12, 20 drawings in them. But there were hundreds and hundreds of them. So there was the American Folk Art Museum has a collection of 100 of his best drawings. But that's really what led him to be an artist. It became a way for him to express himself, so that the paintbrush, he was an incredibly verbal guy and very well read, but the paintbrush ended up becoming an extension of his thoughts in a way that he couldn't communicate. And that came from that early intervention by somebody saying, you should really try drawing.
Awesome. Thank you, Jack, for your question. And thank you, Mark. And from one Mark to another, we have Mark Shanker, who has a question about art and political power. Mark Shanker, are you here? And can you unmute yourself? Too many Marks in this room.
Hello?
Yes.
You can hear me now. So I also met your father once at 1199.
Yeah.
And he was a friend, actually, of my uncle, who did a lot of political organizing on the waterfront. But my questions are, your father was a political activist and then put most of his energy into painting. How did he conceive of the power of art in a political context?
So there's a really good film done by a guy who's deceased now named Glenn Piercy that we're hoping to put on the website in the not too distant future. So he really felt that, art, if you think about Diego Rivera, of course, and Goya, and even Bruegel, like if you think about these people who kind of capture the visceral experiences of their time, not in an abstract way, but in a realistic way, he felt that was a political tool. But also at the end of his life, Ron Carver, who I mentioned, created a program called Public Domain, and he brought my father around to schools. Unions supported the production of posters. The posters were sold to raise money to purchase paintings and put them in public locations. And that's something we have to add to the website, is where all of these are. For instance, the Ellis Island Museum has that family supper painting I showed in the beginning. That's actually at the Ellis Island Museum. New York City subway system has a subway riders painting, 54th Street station, where the Museum of Modern Art is. So he went around to students, and there's a great documentation of him speaking to high school students and middle school students and explaining to them how, whatever disturbs you in your belly as an artist, you need to get out on the canvas and communicate to the world. But he also used the posters at that later stage of his life for a tremendous number of strikes. 1199 produced a lot of posters as well. And he would go to strikes and they would sell the posters for $5, $10 and raise money for the strike fund. So he really felt that art needed to play this role. And he had felt that as a union organizer before he became a painter. He really felt that a union hall needs to be a cultural place, a place where you go, and 1199 embodies that, a place that you go to see musical performances and see art exhibits. And so he really felt art should be, a political life should be imbued with art and politics, and that they're inseparable.
Can I just ask one quick more question
Sure.
again? As he was painting, did he sketch out his paintings, or did he improvise as he went along?
So it's very interesting, somewhere along the line, and I think it was self-taught, and I watched him paint from my very early age. He actually picked up this kind of very traditional way of working up a painting. So he would take a piece of charcoal and he would sketch out a composition, very abstract, just some circles and diagonals and triangles. And then he would fill the area with washes, and then he would work the painting up in layers, but constantly evolve it. So he had no idea what the final composition was going to look like. He just kind of worked it up from this overall idea of perspective and scale. And of course, his perspective is untaught. And I have a great anecdote about that. He once was trying to draw the floor at the later stage of his painting career, when he was having more difficulty painting because he wasn't as engaged in the political life of his times. And he knew I had taken a drafting course. And he said, Mark, I can't understand how to do this floor, the tiles, they don't look right. How do I do this floor? So there was a drafting table that my son has in his apartment. And I sat down and I did a demonstration of 1-point and 2-point perspective, because I was trained to be an industrial arts teacher. He watched patiently. He looked at what I was doing. He said, fuck you, and went back to his painting. It was very much self-taught.
Great. So the next question is from Jeffrey Blum. He wants to learn more about your father's experience in the Spanish Civil War. So Jeffrey Blum, are you here?
I am. Actually, the question is from my wife, but we're on
Oh, yes.
so tell him, go ahead. I think this question might actually have been answered already. I asked if he ever depicted the Spanish Civil War in his art, and I learned that he didn't. But can Marc say more about his experience in the Lincoln Brigade?
Sure. So he really, it was such a, I mean, imagine a kid who grew up in and out of a juvenile detention facility, surrounded by mafia, and you know, kids getting in trouble stealing, and ending up in this incredibly this group of people from Germany, France, Spain, Italy, like all of these, this really cosmopolitan environment. He even said he met Hemingway there. There was a writing contest and he submitted an essay, and he was not a writer. And Hemingway liked his essay, and Hemingway probably said that to every vet. I went over and congratulated them for their writing. So it was really a life-changing experience. There was some controversy that upset my mother more than my father. At one point in the out in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, somebody said, well, he left early, and then even the word deserter was thrown around. But my understanding from my father was that he was a truck driver, and his troops were being sent, and I can't remember which battle it was, but he really felt they were being sent, that the guy, his commander, might have been a spy, and that they were being sent as cannon fodder. And so he left. I'm not sure what period of the war that was, but he knew, and an inordinate amount of vets, every vet that I met loved my father, had a great relationship. So I don't think the deserter story is true. But his experience, I mean, going over there as a 22-year-old guy who had been radicalized by his experience working in a textile factory and from his mother's kind of intellectual bent, you know, really then he became a true intellectual. He was self-taught. He had a 6th grade education, but his book collection, he had, you know, probably a couple thousand books. I have a couple hundred that are in my wife's office at Stony Brook University that I've saved, that are first edition, you know, Black Reconstruction, first edition. They read it when it came out. So really just amazing intellectual. And I think that the Spanish Civil War is what made him that person.
Thank you, Marc. And we have, just to keep everyone in check, we have just space for one more question. We want to be respectful on everyone's evening. So I'm going to hand it over to Debbie Pope if you're here to ask your question or your questions.
Yeah, hi. So I'm very curious about your father's political evolution over time. Clearly, I see in the paintings things like Stalinism written. And did his politics evolve and change and develop? And what were maybe some of the seminal events that caused their evolution?
So Reagan was, I mean, he really became disoriented. He went to see a psychologist. He was taking some kind of medication for anxiety. I think the Reagan era really disoriented him in ways that he had never been disoriented before. Of course, so many of the headlines were, you know, just damning about all the terrible things the Soviet Union had done. And, you know, there's a good essay on that Farewell Comrade painting. I think it's on the Farewell Comrade painting in the exhibit catalog by Paul D'Ambrosio. And Paul spent an inordinate amount of time interviewing my father. He really became a member of the family during the time he was writing his dissertation. And he does a fantastic job of explaining that evolution. But he never lost the idea that, you know, my mother used to quote it all the time, you know, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And the idea that people should be valued, that we shouldn't have elites, haves and have-nots, that people should be valued for their inherent qualities, all people. And that migrants, you know, the phrase I've been using for it lately, it's not something my father used, but, you know, migration is a biological imperative. People have always migrated. I just watched the film Iceman, which is a kind of fictional depiction of Ötzi, who was a early civilized person, probably Neolithic person, or Mesolithic person who was found 1,000 miles or whatever from home. Like, why is that person migrating? People have always migrated. So he really believed in the notion of immigrants trying to just make their lives better, and that was part of humanity. So those ideals always stuck with him. And he would have always called himself a leftist. He never stopped being a leftist. But he was very confused by the Reagan era and what was happening in the United States. And because his personal life had become very comfortable. He lived in a suburban home. He had a big studio. He had his kids, you know, getting married and having kids. And, you know, things started to work very comfortable on a personal basis. But what was happening in the world around him in Latin America and Central America, and we were avid readers of The Nation magazine and Z magazine and Alexander Coburn's articles. So it really became difficult for him to kind of associate with what was happening in the world around him.
Thank you, Mark. Jeffrey Bloom was just asking for the link to the catalog if you have it.
It's if you go to fasanella.org,
okay, awesome.
There's a tab that says exhibits, and then if you scroll down, you'll see the catalog, and you can download a PDF of it.
Awesome. So we're just coming short to 8 p.m. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure seeing some of you. Peter Hartzman, I remember you from class. Thank you for coming. Julia Newman, is it Julia? Yeah, Julia, thank you. I remember you coming to class as well to show us your documentary. So thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure. Take care. Enjoy your evening.